أعوذ بالله من الشيطان اللعين الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome viewers to this third episode of the IslamiCity's Muharram program. The episode 3 is called Courage Under Fire. Today we will explore the Imam Hussein's courage and showing that his fearlessness when standing up for his principles and values, even in the face of dire consequences, was something that needs to be learned from, and we need to take lessons from it. With me is Dr. Abdullah, who will be joining me in this discussion on courage under fire. Allow me with a brief preamble before I invite Dr. Aslam to join us. You know, his arrival in Karbala marked the beginning of a saga of sacrifice, courage, and commitment to the principle of justice and righteousness, which, as we know, culminated in the tragic battle of Karbala on the 10th of Muharram. I want you to picture this, and then we will talk about courage, and Dr. Aslam will discuss this further. But I just want you to understand the scene. It was on the second day of Muharram when Hussein's caravan reaches Karbala. By that time, thousands of Yazid soldiers were already there, having arrived long before Imam Hussein. As the caravan arrives, there's a small tribe living in Karbala at that time called the tribe of Banu Asad. And they gather around Imam Hussein's caravan. Now, Imam Hussein does something very, very strange, but he knew what he was doing. He, after talking to them, inquires about the price of land in Karbala. And how could he buy that land? What was he doing trying to buy a land in Karbala? Well, the next conversation that takes place between Imam Hussein and the Kabila of Banu Asad, the tribe, that he addresses the menfolk of the tribe and said, "Oh, menfolk of Karbala, we have not come here to fight. Yazid soldiers will fight with us and we will be killed. But they will not bury our bodies, and our bodies will be left to wild animals of the desert. I request a favor from you. Please bury our bodies in the land that I have bought from you." And then intuitively he turns to the womenfolk and said, "Oh, ladies of Karbala, your menfolk, out of fear of Yazid soldiers, might not bury our bodies. Ladies, please come out of your houses and bury our bodies." This is recorded in history. And somehow Hussein still did not feel that perhaps his request may not be carried out. He finally turns to the children who had gathered around and speaks gently to them, said, "Oh, children, if your father or mother are for whatever reason unable to bury us, I beg you to throw a fistful of sand over our bodies while you're playing the fields. That way, children, perhaps our bodies will slowly get buried." And then he turns to everyone who had gathered and said, "My second request to you is to look after the people who will come to visit our graves after our death. They will be my guests. So please look after them and feed them for 3 days." Friends, that was the poignant moment as he arrives in Karbala. He was certain of its fate. And he begins that preparation. Not only that, but he's thinking about his legacy. That when the pilgrims come, they will understand the essence of his teachings. Today, with the global connections, one does not necessarily only need to visit Karbala, but that particular spirit imbibes with us all. And this series that we are doing is indeed part and parcel of understanding the legacy of an event that would forever leave a deep impact on not just the Islamic world, but on humanity at large, symbolizing the external struggle or the eternal struggle against oppression, injustice. So I will request Dr. Aslam to explore the visage of Imam Hussein's courage and what is it about showing fearlessness when standing up for one's principles and values in the face of dire consequences. Dr. Aslam, please.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi shaitan rajim. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Thank you very much, Dr. Walji, for giving this introduction. Before I come to the courage of Imam Hussein, let's focus on the general understanding of courage in not only religious scriptures, but I think in secular scriptures as well. Courage, we know, is a choice. It is the willingness to challenge agony, to challenge pain, to challenge danger, and to challenge intimidation. And of course, it is the bravery in the battlefield. We can talk about the physical courage, which is to endure pain and hardship, even death, or threat of one's life. And we can talk of the moral courage, which is the ability to act right, fully and rightly in the face of the opposition, in the face of the confrontation. Now, one of the definitions that basically fascinated me most about courage was in the Chinese text, Tao Te Ching. It's a famous text, and which basically talks about the physical and moral courage and defines courage as an act of love, extreme act of love. And that kept me wondering, how can we relate love with courage? Because love is usually, is a concept that is very soft, very mild, very compassionate kind of concept. And while the courage requires some bold physical actions as well, in addition to moral actions. But what basically happens, it's the love of one's own ideals, not for oneself, but for others, that instills courage among those who are especially chosen and crafted by divine to play a major role in the history of humanity. And this is something that we find very evident in the life of Imam Hussein. That he understood the physical challenges that he would come across, but his moral values were so strong, and his love for the future and for the sake for the survival and soul of Islam was so intense that he was ready to offer everything that he had for that cause. As we talked about the leadership, style of that he communicated that message very clearly, and he prepared his family and his supporters for moral courage and for physical courage. Many of the companions, the Prophet, were reluctant to have that kind of physical courage. They might have the moral courage to believe in the wrong that was being committed, but they did not have the physical courage. And the politics of that particular time definitely did not allow the people in general to demonstrate that moral courage through taking the physical steps to identify with the cause of Imam Hussein in practical sense, even though they might be willing, even though they might be ready to from moral perspective, to take that kind of stand, as we find that after the incident of Karbala, what happened in many places of the Muslim world at that particular time, and how people throughout the centuries have kept on focusing on that kind of thing. So I think this is a courage which is we find quite unique uh, in our human history, and we don't find many examples. Uh, right now, we you can, in ancient Rome, in ancient Greece, and Western traditions, and Eastern traditions, and even the modern world, and then the Chinese and other, and you can find this uh, manifestation of courage depending on the political and the social environment. But this kind of courage that we see in the character of Imam Hussein is quite unique in the sense that here is a descendant of the Prophet who was trained by the Prophet, who lived under the shade of the Prophet, who imbibed the traditions of the Prophet, was standing up for the cause that his grandfather had struggled, ever since he declared his prophethood. So it is, I think, in this particular context that we have to look at the issue of the courage. So, in other words, what we can say that it was the ability of Imam Hussein to act for a meaningful perspective, that in noble, good, or practical, political, cultural, religious cause, despite experiencing the challenges and the fear. And then he was able to articulate it not only in his words, but also to convince the people around him that that was the right thing to do, and this is something that must be done. So this courage that was demonstrated by him, it was a willful, intentional act. It was a mindful deliberation. It involved objective, substantial risk. He knew about it. He was motivated to bring about a noble good, and how individuals, not only in his family but in the future, might feel and might relate to that message. And then he enabled the family and his own self to free them from one of the worst kind of things that we can think of, and that is fear. Fear of death, fear of power, fear of everything. So I think it is in this particular context we see, because we realize that courage, like the leader, communication is the essence of leadership. Courage is the essence of life itself. Without courage, nothing is possible. Nothing is possible. And if we see the the movement of Islam, the movement of dignity of human being coming into reality beyond words. We find behind and in the background those figures who showed courage as part of their mission, and who, without any fear, communicated to the world that unless you have courage, faith has no meaning. And I'll give it back to Dr. Walji.
Thank you, Dr. Aslam. So beautifully framed in terms of the definition of courage. As we know, and you rightly pointed out, that this courage that he had wasn't merely physical. It was a matter of heart and spirit, and your juxtaposition of courage and love that you quoted is very insightful. Here, it was, for Imam Hussein, it was a matter of heart and spirit. He showed an unyielding adherence to his principles, even in the face of death. So, as you were describing courage, a thought occurred to me that just like, darkness isn't just the absence of light. There are many manifestations of that. So courage then is more than just the absence of fear or to ability to confront a danger head on. It's much deeper than that. And the love, courage comparison that you made fits so well into this. For example, when we look at darkness, it can be understood in a broader sense beyond just the absence of light. It can have metaphorical, symbolic connotations representing various aspects of states beyond physical illumination. And the same thing with physical courage. Normally, courage is thought of in those terms that there is a level of physical courage and maybe more moral courage. But in the metaphorical and symbolic sense, just as darkness can represent ignorance, despair, and evil, so can, the idea of the opposite of courage. And courage, I think, in its purest form, as we said, encompasses much more than the absence of fear. The wider dimension of that is that it involves taking a stance for what one believes in, regardless of the consequences. And the love of God comes in here to say this is purely for the pleasure of one's maker, that you have the courage to take actions in the beliefs, in defending the truth and justice that has been, given to you to understand by our maker. So such a courage, individual's courage, resonates deeply with many, as you mentioned, inspiring many others in the history of humanity in terms of showing that courage. And I think it was the bigger picture that Imam Hussein saw, the societal norms where the Prophet had tilted the balance had come back. For example, back in the day, the Arab cultures had a strong emphasis on group survival rather than individualism. People had to stick together in tribes and clans to thrive and stay safe. The social solidarity within the tribes of what they referred to as Asabiya was like that deep bond that the Blessed Prophet, peace be upon him, had tried to demolish, this idea of tribalism, of Asabiya in the period of Jahiliyyah. Now you could see, merely 50 years after the death of the Prophet, you could see that the Asabiya was playing a significant role again in Arab culture of the time. Towards, his last days, at his last sermon, in his speech, the Prophet stated very clearly to absolutely underscore this idea of going away from Asabiya in the days of Jahiliyyah. And this is a call for all time to say, he said, and I quote, that an Arab has no superiority over a non-Arab, nor a non-Arab has any superiority over an Arab. A white person has no superiority over a black, Nor does a black person have any superiority over white, except by piety and good action. These very values were being challenged. Sadly, in less than 50 years, and these were the societal norms that Imam Hussein was challenging by taking his stand. And you mentioned that there are others, who have been inspired in the annals of history. There are many individuals, who have done that. Imam Hussein's courage was perhaps unique in more ways than one, combining a lot of impactful elements, whether it was spiritual, metaphysical, physical, moral. They were all combined in his powerful statement and testament to the resilience of the human spirit and the indomitable power of truth and justice. But then you also see that to various degrees, for example, in Mahatma Gandhi. We talked about him, and we always do when we talk about justice. But famously, it was Mahatma Gandhi who said that I learned from Hussain how to achieve victory while being oppressed, indicating, again, the same principles and how he was influenced. There were others who were in turn influenced by Mahatma Gandhi. Martin Luther King, an iconic figure. His unwavering commitment to non-violence and justice, even in the face of police brutality, imprisonment, death, threats, again mirrors that steadfastness displayed by Imam Hussein. We don't have to go far. In American history, you got Rosa Parks. She may not have heard of Imam Hussein, but she certainly demonstrated his spirit in refusing to give up her seat, to a white passenger on a bus. Well, again, she remained steadfast in her principles, sparking the Montgomery bus boycott and a turning point in the American civil rights movement. These individuals come on the scene and they tilt the balance of what are societal norms and change those norms. Desmond Tutu in South Africa did something similar. His dedication to human rights, again, resonates so deeply with the legacy of Imam Hussein. Harriet Tubman, an escaped slave, she risked her life making numerous attempts to the South to guide other slaves to freedom. Again, she may not have heard of Imam Hussein, but this is the spirit, the suffragette movement. And for example, the tank man, which I cannot take the image out of my mind when you see this unidentified Chinese man who stands in front of a column of tanks leaving, Tiananmen Square in June 1989. This was the morning after the Chinese military had suppressed the protests by force. Again, his identity and fate remain unknown, but his act of defiance against a show of military force becomes a powerful symbol of resistance. So there are these. So our takeaway today, before I hand this over to Dr. Aslam to conclude this session, is Imam Hussein's message was clear. Never compromise your beliefs and principles under even the most challenging circumstances. And his legacy continues to inspire people across cultures, religious affiliation, because that was the human spirit that was being demonstrated to instill that level of steadfastness in the pursuit of justice. In fact, the idea of justice and righteousness, a subject that we will try and cover under the spirit of sacrifice today. So, Dr. Aslam, please let us have some concluding remarks and a dua from you.
Thank you very much. I think one of the important things to remember is that the courage and those people who demonstrate courage are not only what we can call the leaders, but also the social scientists. They understand the society. They understand where the power elites are taking the people and the society to. And they analyze it from the perspective of the belief system and the moral values that they stand for. And they make a choice, a deliberate choice. It is not based on emotions, not based on impulsive nature, not based on their personal interest, but based on the future of the belief system that they have. And I think this is something to remember, that when we are making a choice in terms of demonstrating courage, we have to look at the rationals behind showing that courage. Emotions and sentiments are one thing, but a rational understanding of demonstrating courage is another. And that is very evident, that despite the fact that the outcome was very visible, and despite the fact that the conclusion was already in his mind that this is what is going to happen, he stood up and he took the first step towards the realization of that noble goal of saving the soul of Islam and saving the future. And I think this is something that we need to basically look. Unfortunately, what has happened, Dr. Walji, that Imam Hussein has been turned into a Shia icon. He's not a Shia or Sunni. He is a follower of the Prophet. He is someone who has been trained by the Prophet. He is someone who comes from the family of the Prophet. He is someone who demonstrates the qualities that the Prophet wanted every believer to have. So to identify him as an iconic figure of this particular sect or that particular sect is in fact a betrayal of our commitment to Islam and commitment to Prophet and commitment to faith. And that is something that we have to realize, that regardless whether, in our times we call ourselves, or we have been classified as belonging to this particular sect or that particular sect, we have to rise above all those kind of sectarian identities that we have imposed upon ourselves as the result of historical uh, circumstances, and identify with those value system and that kind of moral and physical courage that was demonstrated by Imam Hussein in the worst period of uh, times uh, as far as the religious history is concerned. Because remember, the the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam was sent primarily to ensure that the wrongs that were done by the previous generations are not repeated. And Imam Hussein wanted to make sure that the dream of his grandfather lives on, in terms of making sure that the religion is not contaminated and the faith remains pure in its spirit and its practical aspects. And what the tyrants had done, that they had taken that soul away from Islam while singing or beating the drums of Islam. And I think this is something that is courage exposed. And I think we should basically realize that. So based on that kind of thing, let us conclude today's discussion with the recitation of the Quranic surah. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم والعصر إن الإنسان لفي خسر إلا الذين آمنوا وعملوا الصالحات وتواصوا بالحق وتواصوا بالصبر. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, we ask you to give us the wisdom to understand the courage and to live the courage in every day of our life, the way our forefathers and our leaders, especially Imam Hussein, have shown to us while fighting against the tyrant. سبحان ربك رب العزة عما يصفون وسلام على المرسلين والحمد لله رب العالمين.